before we start the show, would you allow me to do a little thought experiment? Summer, it's coming. You've booked your holiday, you board the plane, you switch your phone off, hopefully for a couple of weeks. But here is the conundrum. How do you catch up on everything you've missed in a simple, digestible form? Well, step forward the Week's Magazine app. The Week features extracts from all the best journalism and opinion of the past week. Problem solved. And by a marvellous coincidence, you can get 50% off all subscriptions to the Week's Magazine app at theweek.co.uk/sale. And if you prefer a paper copy, get the next 6 issues in print and on your iPad or Android tablet for just £1. Head to theweek.co.uk/sale to choose your discount. It is a bargain. Treat yourself this bank holiday weekend to a subscription to the Week's Magazine app. Go to theweek.co.uk/sale now. And now on with the show. It's the week ending Saturday, the 26th of May, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen Italy forming its first populist coalition government, Ireland taking to the polls over abortion law, and swathes of spam emails hitting European inboxes as the GDPR deadline looms. But we're here to bring you some of the stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And joining me from the Week's digital team are Rebecca Gillie, Jamie Timson and Arion McNicoll. All-star lineup this week. Starting the show is Rebecca, though. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Is Calpol the new laudanum?
How do you guys deal in general with all those little
aches and pains? Calpol is definitely the wonder drug. We have more than our fair share of syringes in the cupboard. Loads of them.
The syringes.
I don't feel we use it all the time. It's not, right, it's bedtime, we'll brush your teeth and here's some Calpol and off you go to bed. So I know it's not a routine in that sense, so I don't feel bad in that way, but it does make me question when we've used that much.
That was Charlotte speaking to Dr. Chris Van Tulleken for a new TV series called The Doctor Who Gave Up Drugs. It's available now in the UK on BBC iPlayer. Rebecca, before we get going with this story then, define for us, firstly, what's laudanum?
Laudanum was a powerful opiate drug that was used, commonly used as a medicine to soothe fussy children in the Victorian era.
And Calpol, for international listeners?
Is a liquid form of paracetamol that's given to children. It's sweet tasting and purple and very iconic among generations of Brits.
Yeah, also known as infant Tylenol in the USA.
I will never accept that, but okay.
Right, so we're all on that is a fact. Okay, so we're all on the same page. Why is this your story of the week?
Okay, so it's been in the news this week precisely because of this new BBC documentary, which posits that we have become addicted to Calpol. A GP who features in the documentary, not Chris Van Tulleken, who is a GP, but one of the people he interviews, describes Calpol as the heroin of childhood. Brits spend £64 million a year buying Calpol, and we give it to our children at a rate 3 times higher than 40 years ago. To clarify, when they say heroin of childhood, they do not mean that children are literally tiny smackheads addicted to Calpol, but that they become addicted to the process of actually getting Calpol and end up asking for it repeatedly, and it gets into this cycle because they're addicted to the process.
It is worth pointing out as well that it does now come in a syringe.
Yes, that's to give it to babies.
There's a visual metaphor there as well.
Yeah, it's unfortunate.
But it never used to when we were kids, did it?
That new version of Trainspotting on CBBC is a bit weird.
So, Arion, I'm a dad, and I do treat every headache that my son has with Calpol because it is really fun to just squirt it into his mouth, and it does resolve the problem. He goes to sleep. But it's only about, 7-8 times a year? Is that too many? Is it really a big deal?
I think that's the question that's being asked by this documentary, because the problem wouldn't be a problem if people took Calpol the way that it was designed to be taken. And the problem is, according to the documentary, people are giving it to their children too much. And actually, if you do take too much paracetamol, it does become a problem. So it sounds like you're not going to be contacted by any agencies trying to take your child away from you. But the problem would exist if you started to ramp up the dosage. And that's what's what the GP is trying to avoid.
But if you read the bottle, Jamie, you talk about what it's supposed to be taken for. It says fever. Basically, it doesn't say every time they got a raised temperature.
I loved Calpol. I mean, actually, to be honest, the worst bit was when you had to go from this is a niche reference, but we're a niche podcast. It was when you had to go from the 2+ to the 6+. And the 6+ was so not as good as the 2+. And so sometimes I would think...
Remind us of the difference. Less strawberry, less sugar?
It's just less sweet, less nice flavoured. And then they'd be like... and then eventually you'd move on to, like, cough syrup. And you're just thinking, what's the point? Give me Calpol. Give me Calpol
this
again.
This is the voice of childhood Calpol addiction.
Yeah.
speaking.
Oh, absolutely. And also I think 6 or 7 times a year is really quite little.
It's
like, because kids get sick all the time.
But this is the thing, it's seen as harmless. In the great scheme of things, your over-the-counter painkillers are relatively low risk, but there are risks, which I think a lot of people don't really keep in mind, because Calpol's, it's pink, it's sweet. Everyone, parents who are giving it to their children now themselves will remember taking it as children. But there is a risk. Children who, I think just once a year, babies who are given infant Calpol have a 5 times higher risk of developing asthma. There's also risks to organs, particularly your liver, which is, again, it's rare, but it is a risk that's present. One of the things that's mentioned on the box is encouraging parents to use it as a treatment for fever, whereas in the documentary, Dr. Van Tulleken makes the case that you shouldn't actually be using Calpol to treat high temperatures, because high temperature is part of the body's way of fighting off infections, etc., and that if your child, obviously, if they have a very high fever, then you should be seeking medical help. But really, Calpol should only be used as a mild painkiller, and it should not be used for every ache and pain. He takes issue also with the slogan that has been used by the Calpol in the past, which is that it lets kids be kids, which gives parents this impression that there's something unnatural or wrong about having a child who's a bit listless or grumpy and poorly, which obviously, isn't the case.
I think the problem, speaking as a parent, probably comes from the fact that it does have the effect of putting infants to sleep when they're having a difficult night. And so it's not actually about letting kids be kids. It's about letting adults have a night's sleep. And that's probably not a reason to medicate someone. It's not a reason that you'd medicate an adult, is it?
And you could
just get them to shut up.
Come up with a better drug if you wanted to just put kids to sleep.
But I mean, this has always been a perennial, issue for parents. And we were talking about the risks of Calpol, but in our grandparents' day, nothing was thought about giving a kid a little nip of whiskey to get them to sleep. So I mean, that is kind of a repetitive theme in parenting throughout history, and it's not just a hatchet job on Calpol, which again, when used correctly, there's nothing wrong with it. It's about the over-medication of kids generally, which is something that is also explored in the documentary about much higher number of children taking medications, things like ADHD, and are we over-medicating normal childhood behaviour?
I've only seen the trails for the documentary, but I mean, apart from the fact that I think he's a bit smarmy, I actually think it's quite an interesting and something that needs to be on BBC One and mainstream, something that needs to be on kind of primetime television is this idea of, are we over-medicating ourselves in general? I was really shocked when I was kind of growing up and realised that lots and lots of people my age take painkillers for hangovers, and I'd never done that. I'd kind of assumed that you had to pay your dues, if you've done the time, as it were. But lots and lots of people do, and I think actually painkillers have become a kind of like a natural day-to-day, substitute for perhaps, just actually getting on with it.
But also there's another thing going on here, which is the attempt to prevent children from getting unwell in the first place. And there was that other fascinating study that came out this week about the connection between parents attempting to stop their children from being infected with anything and what looks like a link to childhood leukemia, which is a terrifying prospect, but sort of underlines the fact that we're now in a state where parents are really trying to not only treat their children once they are sick, but prevent them from getting sick in the first place. And there's evidence to suggest that exposure to bugs is no bad thing. So we're sort of coming at it doubly incorrectly.
But there's huge amounts of hypocrisies all over this, isn't there? Because by the same token, people know about chickenpox, for example, that you're better to expose your children to that than to keep them away from it because it's more painful and more destructive when you're an adult. And then there's this business of doctors themselves and perhaps the hypocrisy that they have the message of don't take too many antibiotics. And so the alternative to that kind of is paracetamol, isn't it? And treating using that stuff. And okay, maybe there's a grander message of just don't take so many drugs at all. But you understand why the public turn to paracetamol and ibuprofen as well, because that's what's left to you if you're not taking antibiotics.
You do, but if doctors say you're using the drug wrong, then you have to listen to what the doctors are saying. And particularly with fever, the documentary said that actually the best treatment for fever is still putting a damp, cold cloth on the head of the fever sufferer rather than giving them paracetamol. And there's all sorts of uncertainties about what paracetamol actually does. But the macro point is you have to listen to what the doctors are saying.
Rebecca?
It's just part of it, sort of reflects the prescription culture in a way where we've come to expect that if there's something wrong with you, then something must be done about it. The idea that, you know, you can just put cold flannel on your forehead and you'll feel better just doesn't, to a lot of people, I think increasingly, it just doesn't feel like a real solution. I remember reading a really interesting article by a French woman who moved to London. France is well known for having a culture of prescription drugs, and she was astonished to come to London and find that when she had a blocked ear, the doctor suggested she try putting some olive oil in it. You know, but there is still something to be said for those, you know, for those simple solutions. But I think we have increasingly come to expect that any malady should be met with a prescription or a medicine.
Do you think actually maybe people just need to be sick more? You know, like
maybe
actually we just do need to get into a situation where we're happy with people being ill and you know, not having this pressure on people to not be able to take time off work and actually, you know, if we're thinking about the greater good of society, perhaps what we want is more people to be convalescing rather than being forced into a situation that they don't want to be in.
I mean, and even if you don't take it as take that argument as, well, people just need to be sick more, at least we need to recognise that our own medical progress has limits. You know, we haven't got as far as we might like to think we have. The treatment for a broken arm is still strap it up and wait until it gets better, you know. So yeah, good point. You can't just expect to be able to solve all your children's ailments and woes with drugs. Sometimes you just got to let them be sick.
And is there an issue with what you flagged up earlier, Jamie, which was the taste when you're a kid actually being pleasant and reassuring? Is that something that we should be changing? We should be saying, okay, well, if we don't want kids to be addicted to it and asking for it, then don't make it taste nice.
Absolutely not. No. It's one of the nicest things. I remember the first time I had flu when I was a kid, and it was horrible. I thought I was going to die. Like, absolutely thought I was going to die. And the only nice part of that aspect of it was the sweet, sugary goodness of Calpol.
A spoonful of sugar helps the medicine go down.
Exactly. Well, just imagine if they'd had Calpol when Mary Poppins was around.
In the most addictive way. Allegedly. Arion, you're next. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
This week, Southeast Asia came together to try to break the bad.
Well, this is a massive, growing problem in Southeast Asia. Basically, what's happened is a lot of drug dealers, drug lords who were involved in heroin production and opium production have now switched in recent years to meth. And there's a few reasons behind this. First, meth is much cheaper to produce, so it yields much higher profits for drug traffickers, drug lords. And also, meth can be made in underground laboratories that are highly mobile, so they don't have to rely on huge open fields of poppies growing anymore, which are much easier for the authorities to track. Meth production can be done almost anywhere.
Celia Hatton speaking this week to the BBC's Global News podcast. You can find that wherever you got this podcast. Arion, more drugs.
More drugs.
Meth.
Yes.
The Calpol of... I don't know where it's Southeast Asia. Okay, fine. How bad is this problem?
It's getting worse, and it's long been fairly serious, but now just this week the UN warned that meth production and trafficking has reached alarming levels, they said. And in a bid to combat this, a number of Southeast Asian countries came together for a 2-day conference that was held in Myanmar, and they were specifically trying to work out what to do about drug production in the region that you just heard her mention, the Golden Triangle, which is a region where Myanmar, Laos and Thailand meet. For a long time it was a place where opium was produced, but increasingly we're seeing meth being produced there.
So meth is in, heroin's out.
Yep.
I mean, she sort of explained a little bit in that clip why, but what's the appeal to criminal networks? Is it just not being detected, or is there a higher market value as well?
Cheaper to produce, easier to produce without being detected, as you say. But also there's a hugely growing appetite for it, not only in those Southeast Asian countries where it's being produced, but internationally. Massive growth in Australia, interestingly. Increasingly it's being used in the US, though it hasn't been quite as explosive as it's been in Australia, New Zealand, and the sort of Australasia region. Curiously, it's not so popular in the UK, but yeah, it's enough of a problem that recreationally it's used by users looking for a good time, but also a lot of working people and poorer people in Southeast Asia use it because it's a stimulant and it can help them get through an otherwise pretty horrible working day, either in a factory or driving a taxi or a bus or whatever.
But really? Help them get through a working day? I mean, I have a very working understanding of the effects of meth, but Rebecca, it seems to me that it's as bad as heroin or not, or worse, isn't it? It's not...
Well, yes.
Something you can easily file under recreation.
Well, yes, but I mean, the thing is, the last thing we want in the UK is the arrival of a brand new wave of drug addiction. The problem being that, and obviously it's hard to quantify which drug is worse than which drug, but any new drug that causes an epidemic is going to require a whole new strategy to counter it, which I think, is why authorities are so keen to kind of limit this spread of meth. I've never really heard much about it within the UK, and I didn't know until I started looking into the story that it was such a problem in Australia and also New Zealand. They've also seized a lot in Japan and basically all around that region where it's easy to distribute from.
I don't know why I'm turning
Asia.
to Jamie to answer this particular question, but it just feels instinctively right. Mm-hmm. It's different to crystal meth, isn't it?
Yeah.
So crystal meth you burn, basically, right?
Yeah.
But these are tablets.
Well, yeah. So, it comes in very many different forms. I think the key thing about meth, and I think why it's so difficult for people to understand, is that actually meth, I think, doesn't fall under the categories of things like cocaine or marijuana or heroin. It is a kind of bastardization. Am I allowed to say that on the podcast? Yeah, bastardization. Yeah. It's a quick and easy high for people who are already addicted to things like heroin. Heroin is more expensive. Meth is a much cheaper version of it. So I think, unsurprisingly, if people know my views, the way to stop this is legalization of and regulation of the harder drugs, to stop people turning to meth because it's cheaper and easier to get hold of. And I think meth will die out. I don't think meth addicts came to meth because they were looking for meth. They came to meth through other things because it was cheaper and easier to get hold of.
But that's not the solution the UN has come up with, is it, Arion? Unsurprisingly. What are they looking at?
Yeah, no. So there are several things that came out of the conference. One of the first things that they wanted to do was to attempt to speed up the peace talks within Myanmar, because one of the problems is that a lot of the drug production is being done in these areas, specifically the Shan, Rakhine and Kachin regions of the country that are in the control of armed ethnic groups. And so to facilitate those areas coming back within the fold of parts of the country that can be controlled, what they want to do is try to speed the talks between the ruling government in Myanmar and all of those different regions. So that's step one. Step two actually sort of ties in with what Jamie's saying, in that for a long time Southeast Asian countries have tended to criminalize drug takers rather than regarding them as patients or victims. And through this conference there was an agreement broadly among the countries that they needed to start treating people in a medical way rather than trying to solve the problem just through outlawing things, locking up criminals and hunting them down, as you've sort of seen with Duterte in the Philippines and so on.
But in your argument, Jamie, I mean, I get it with cannabis. We've seen what happens with that in the States and elsewhere. You have legal dispensaries and they have a certain element of verification and check and balance, and it's basically easy to get hold of, but it's not everywhere. But you can't really do that with heroin, can you? So who ends up dealing it, in other words? Just doctors?
It would be doctors,
But what's that going to cost?
I mean, the amount of money that gets spent on drug users in the world, in terms of locking them up, in terms of crime, is far, far more than it would take to be able to regulate. I mean, just taking an example, in the UK, they've run like methadone clinics, which basically give out heroin and decriminalizes heroin. They've run trials of it, and when users and addicts, because like Arion says, they are almost victims, when they have easy access to the thing that they need to get by during the day, they no longer commit the crime. They no longer are a kind of stain on society. But it needs a complete overhaul of the way that we look at drugs and drug users.
To say it's worth drawing the distinction between decriminalisation and legalisation. Is decriminalisation, like they have in Portugal, of hard drugs, just means that you won't be prosecuted or put into the criminal justice system for using them. It doesn't mean you can, go up to the shop on the corner and buy a roll of smack. Is that drugs?
Yes, smack is drugs.
I think the other thing is that this is an obvious side effect of what's happened with globalization. The more and more the countries have become connected, and there's something. I think there's 420 million shipping containers. I don't think I'm reading. I think roughly around 420 million shipping containers across the sea every year, and it's 90% of the world's cargo, and they're not going to be able to check every shipping container. And this is something that whereas before it was kind of probably bounty, pirates and all of those things, now what we're looking at is that this is a natural side effect of globalization.
And especially where you have massive demand in a place like Australia, which has a large amount of unguarded coastline, and the drug can be sold for much higher profit. That's why you get that movement of meth in particular from Southeast Asia to Australia. But yeah, it's a problem that's going to be really difficult to solve, especially given that it's a globalized marketplace now. And part of the other problem, and one of the other pledges from this meeting, was that China, which is involved in the production of the base chemicals that go towards making meth, has agreed to try to stamp out the import of those sort of pre-meth chemicals to the Golden Triangle region. So it's kind of it is a problem that needs this kind of joined up response. And so it was significant that they came together to try to do that.
And what is for want of a better phrase, what is the class of people that take meth, particularly in places like Australia? I mean, you talked about people going to work. So is this a middle class drug now?
Well, in Australia, it goes from everything from what used to be called speed, a sort of much lower level party drug, to everything that's more like crystal meth, which is the very intense form that's meant to be about 5 times as powerful as speed used to be. So speed continues to be a party drug, but it has a relationship with this much harder drug that has tended to be taken by people who are poorer and usually in much more dire straits. So actually its use is very widespread, and in fact the broad class of amphetamine-type stimulants, or ATS, type drugs is now the second most taken class of drug in the world after cannabis. So it's huge, but it's not limited to just one class.
And in the US, I've read previously that there's an increasing problem with students, with college students taking meth to stay up and study under pressure for exams and things like that.
In the UK, we have the issue of spice, which is a kind of a similar drug. It's not meth, but it is a similar type of drug which has kind of ridden the kind of the prison systems and stuff. And lots of homeless people have access to it. It used to be a legal high, but now it's been classified as a drug. But it has a kind of similar, like, stupefying and quite horrendous effect on lower class.
But under your argument of, just to return to this finally, let's legalise hard drugs or decriminalise, on that basis, doesn't this prove that even once you do that, something else pops along and fills the vacuum that was there before? There'll be a new drug, there'll be a new high that wasn't legislated for.
There will always be a black market. I don't think anyone that's saying about decriminalisation is suggesting that there won't be, illicit drug taking. But the truth of the matter is that, drugs, for as long as I think for as long as society or civilized society has existed, have ruined people's lives, and it's mainly due to the way, as in lots and lots of countries, the way that it's been criminalized. I think you'll never be able to eradicate people taking illegal substances, but what I think you can do is really help individuals and really change the kind of global thinking on the matter.
But I mean, that's not what people say about gambling, is it? They don't say, oh, the great thing about gambling is when we made it more common and easier for everyone to do.
But we do regard gambling as a psychological affliction now that is treated in that way. You know, we have the idea of gambling addiction. So at least we've come to that point of recognizing it as a social problem that needs to be tackled with some sort of, treatments that are sympathetic to the sufferer.
Okay, Jamie, it's been a very druggy episode. Do you have a drug-based story for us?
No, but I bring news of another referendum.
Voters stand out in large numbers in one of the busiest polling stations in the capital, Bujumbura. They're being asked whether they are for or against constitutional changes that include increasing the presidential term limit from 5 to 7 years. Some voters told us it's their national duty, but weren't entirely clear about what exactly they're voting for, what the political changes entail, and how they'll affect their lives.
We woke up early to vote for a peaceful life. We want to get good schools, hospitals and jobs.
After this, we'll trust each other more. There'll be no fear. We'll be able to solve our problems peacefully.
That was Al Jazeera's Catherine Soy speaking to citizens in Burundi this week. Jamie, you are taking us to Burundi.
Yes.
Didn't see it coming.
Get on board.
Why?
This week, there was a referendum in Burundi where President Nkurunziza has recently been allowed to change the term, has recently been allowed to change the limits on his length of office. He held a referendum. He wanted to change it from 5 to 7 years.
Per term. And how many terms is he allowed?
He was meant to have 2. In 2015,
he was meant to be eligible for 2.
So he was elected in 2005 following the Civil War. It was meant to be 2. He then stood again in 2015. So 2 5-year terms.
Right.
2015.
So the constitution they had didn't stop him standing again anyway.
His rationale was that he'd be the first time in the aftermath of the Civil War he was actually elected by members of parliament and not by the people, so that one didn't count.
Right.
And now he's saying that now the terms have been changed from 5 years to 7 years, it should not count again, and he should be able to start from scratch.
So start again.
So he could
Wow.
potentially rule till 2034.
Okay, that's corrupt, isn't it? Thanks for flagging this up.
It's the same thing that Erdogan did in Turkey. It was like, well, if we change the term limits, then we should probably just start from 0 again.
Well, okay, it is actually the same as what happened in Turkey, but I suppose, and I am making a judgment here about Burundi, but I suppose that the threats that people feel when they go to the poll booth to cast their vote are more severe than in Turkey, where, there are cities in Turkey that feel like slightly more westernised cities than there are in Burundi.
From the reports, there has been quite a lot of. America and the UK recently condemned the harassment of the opposition parties in Burundi.
To be clear, people have died before, haven't they, being threatened with voting against the government in Burundi?
Yes,
right?
yes.
Hence civil war.
Part of the problem. So the thing about Burundi is that it was Tutsi and Hutu, and the constitution for a long time said that it had to be a 60-40 split, but all of the Tutsi between Hutu and Tutsi, and Nkurunziza is half Hutu, half Tutsi, so that's why he was, in 2005, after the Civil War, he was seen as joining the two tribes together. Unfortunately, what's happened more recently is since 2005, all of the Tutsi members of parliament and the military have been replaced with Hutu. So what's actually ended up is a situation not too dissimilar to what started the Civil War way back when. This idea of changing the term limits has become pretty common. In the past decade, 7 Central African countries have either removed or changed it under the direction of the president. Basically, is that a good thing? What do we think? Should we have term limits?
We talked not long ago about what's going on in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where Joseph Kabila is kind of on the verge of doing the same thing. He hasn't yet said whether he's going to run again, which technically he shouldn't be. But the last news we've heard is that posters have been appearing around the country suggesting that he is going to run again. So it is an increasing phenomenon, and we are seeing it particularly in these countries that have been afflicted by a very turbulent past, where attempts to change the people in power have led to bloodshed. And so, leaving aside the fact that this referendum, a lot of people have said, was not carried out fairly, if not rigged, was definitely influenced by intimidation, there is certainly, I think, it's certainly understandable why people in those countries might feel like, you know what, maybe we should just keep the guy we've got now for the time being.
And at the same time, there's a kind of compulsion for the person in charge who has usually got used to being in charge and doesn't want to give it up. And it is quite common in places that are either relatively recently post-coup or revolution or post-colonial. And that speaks for a lot of Central Africa in particular. But you're also seeing the same sort of thing across Latin America and also even parts of Europe. These sort of the emergence of strong man, usually leaders who want to hold on to their power after the allotted time. And there is a sort of temptation for the people to continue voting for that person if the person has benefited their group. And in this case, with Nkurunziza, he represents the Hutu majority. So it's easy to see why there is some popular support for him, as well as the obvious intimidation that's gone on there.
I think the problem comes as when you do have specific places where groups have been put to the prominence by a certain leader, and then them not handing over power or not. There are countries in Africa. Mauritius has successfully switched leaders. South Africa does do staying to elected members. Even the USA, obviously not an African, but they obviously have fixed terms and then they step down. And I feel like in lots and lots of countries that guaranteed switching of power is a fillip to people, because it says that things might not be okay now, but it doesn't mean it's going to last forever.
Which we don't actually have here, do we? So we have fixed-term parliaments now, although as we saw at the last election, the Prime Minister can override that with enough support from Parliament. But also, we don't have the presidential system, so we have a royal family. We have no choice about that and how long they stay at the top of the tree. And then with regards to the Prime Minister, as we saw with Thatcher and Blair, they can do 3 terms theoretically, or 4, until they get kicked out.
The idea is that the party, because we elect a party, the party is meant to get rid of their leader when they are no longer fit for office. I mean, obviously that's not happened in this case that we're living in currently. But I do think that there is an argument for having, fixed terms for leaders, because if you look in America, what's quite nice is that when they have all of the old presidents, they come up on stage, Jimmy Carter's still going, the Bushes, Obama. It's like a really nice, everyone's happy because they've all done their time, got some less than others, but still managed to do it. Whereas if we did the same thing with Cameron and Brown and Major, it's a series of disappointments. It's people being really shifty, being like, I left too when it really got tough. Or John Major, he resigned as leader 2 years before the general election. He didn't want to do it. He had got struggled on for another 2 years.
The thing is, though, is that this sort of touches on the fact that we can afford to chop and change because we're lucky to live in an extremely robust, safe democracy, and I think in the West we have a knee-jerk reaction to, and understandably, to hearing that another Central African country is on the verge of removing term limits and opening the way for a, kind of strongman dictator type model. But part of me thinks it is naive to think that a country can go from a civil war that killed hundreds of thousands of people to suddenly functioning in a perfect Western-style democracy, electing a new government every few years.
But why would you... I understand all that in terms of this, and Arion made the point, there might be affection for this particular president among some of the people, or at least better the devil you know. That's different to changing the constitution so that anyone, once they become president, can stay there basically for an unlimited time.
I don't think he's changing it in the idea that anyone can be president for an unlimited time.
No, in reality it's about him. Sure, but that's what they're voting for. You think in their minds they are just voting for him, not for what they're actually voting for? Well,
yes, and the thing is that he has... We don't really have time to go into it, but he is quite an unusual character. He's relatively young. He was a sports lecturer who still plays on his own football team and is often pictured working alongside farmers in the countryside, which has endeared him a lot to the rural population of Burundi, but he's a lot more unpopular in the cities, which is where the opposition is concentrated. So that I think that he does obviously genuinely have a following, and whether or not the people of Burundi feel like he's going to turn into a dictator, I think most voters, that's what's on their mind is stability in the years to come, and he has promised that, and he has promised to turn Burundi around and make it a success story.
And I think there's also, coming back to your point about the naivety of people within democracies thinking that just anywhere in the world can become a democracy. Democracy is actually very fragile and depends on a whole lot of really quite subtle conditions. And if you don't have all of those functioning, a properly, a proper set of checks and balances, a well-functioning media, etc., you're really in a difficult position to try to have a system at the top that is doing that thing of alternating power between one party and the other. Simultaneously, you've got a model emerging like China, which suddenly looks quite tempting to places that are developing, and it's a political model that is very different to democracy, and it has allowed an entire society and a massive amount of people to get a great deal of wealth in a very short span of time. So you can sort of see the appeal as well of non-democratic models to some parts of the world.
I've always said that a benign dictatorship run by me would be perfect. If I could decide, I think I'd be fair. I'd do all of that. But I do think that for as long as we've decided that democracy, as a globe, have decided that democracy is the way forward, things like this really delegitimizes the concept of democracy. What Nkurunziza is doing.
But Arian's saying we haven't, as a globe, decided it. Actually, huge portions of the world live in China and possibly are quite happy.
But the people of Burundi have decided that democracy is the way forward. Like, they've partaken in democracy for this referendum. They've clearly got involved in the parliamentary system. That's what they want. And following the civil war is what they've... I think it's weird for us to decide that they are in some way backwards when they want freedom as much as the next person.
What happens when you exercise your democratic right to request that your democracy be diluted slightly? Where does that end?
And also in this referendum in particular, there was, every scrutineer said it doesn't look like it was conducted in a fair manner. There was a lot of voting irregularity and pressure.
To take away their democracy further.
No, it isn't. But neither is it a ringing endorsement on their part of the question that they've just been asked.
I guess we need to get a Burundi person in next time and we'll ask them.
Well, we'll certainly be sorting that out. That seems highly likely. That is it from this edition of The Week Unwrapped. My thanks to Jamie Timson, Arion McNicoll and Rebecca Gillie. Please take a moment to rate, review and subscribe to The Week Unwrapped on your podcast app of choice. And if you genuinely are listening in Burundi, let us know what you thought of the quality of that discussion. You can come and see us live as well at the Cheltenham Science Festival on the evening of Thursday the 7th of June. If you use the promo code THEWEEK, you get 50% off the ticket price. And for 1 week only, remember, you can get 50% off a digital subscription to The Week magazine. Just go to theweek.co.uk/sale. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Matt Hill at Rethink Audio. Until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.